It's gotta be so retro. It's gotta be so retro because it's a Retron 5 enough to keep me alive. Hello? Hi, so Matt here with another hardware review. Yes, I thought it was night time to do another hardware review since you guys really liked my Revo K101 Game Boy Advance clone review from a couple of months back. So, here, better late than never, is my review of the Retron 5. It's actually a very opportune time. That's the stabby finger of progress. It's actually a very opportune time to be doing a Retron 5 review because since it was released and since the vast majority of reviews of this console slipped out into the public consciousness, there have been firmware updates and the abilities of the console have rather expanded, which is going to make it quite desirable for people into emulation and importing. But we will get to that. So, for those that don't know, what is the Retron 5? The Retron 5 is a modern games console made by a company called Hyperkin that will allow you to play old cartridge-based games on modern televisions. It upscales those games to 60 frames per second HD, 720p, and it looks absolutely fantastic. So, as you've probably guessed, this is going to be a rather positive review. However, you're not interested in necessarily whether I like it or not, you're interested in what it can do and making your mind up for yourselves. So let's talk about features. First of all, as is traditional with this sort of review, what's in a box? What's in a box? Well, chucking this over there. Ha! Get to fuck, you bastard. Right, let's start with the mundane things. So, the box comes with, besides the console itself, a power supply, an HDMI cable, which is not to be sneezed at, because a lot of people cheap out and don't bundle one in the box. This comes with one. This rather natty controller. I say natty, but we'll get to why I don't use it in a minute. And a charging cable for charging said controller. What's interesting about this is, as you will see, the port on the back of the Retron is a mini USB. And the port on the controller is a micro USB. Now, I have not really seen one of these cables before. I mean, presumably they have existed beforehand, but, you know, that's just quite interesting. So, it's, you know, don't lose this, basically, because they're not that common. It's also, as you can see, ridiculously long. So, they have built this with playing and charging in mind. The controller itself, which will work on any of the games that the Retron supports, is a Bluetooth affair. As you can see, it's kind of follows the Retron's American SNES stylings, all sort of greys and purples. So these would be your sort of 4 face buttons. If you put this in mind of a SNES pad, since that was the console that had really the most buttons, so you've got your face buttons there. You do have start and select. These are actually additional buttons because it does have, as you can see there, it does have shoulder buttons. And these can actually be programmed to use some of the Retron's more unique features. This is actually not an analog stick, but a clicky micro switch stick. We've also got 2 more programmable buttons here and there, which in theory would make this controller, it's back there, make this controller very desirable. The problem is, it's square. Well, it's vaguely oblong, rounded. It's got jagged corners, and it really isn't that comfortable to use. I mean, the D-pad is lovely and responsive, and the buttons work perfectly, and it's nice to have some programmable buttons to use some of the Retron's features, rather than having to use controller shortcuts, which we will get to in a moment. But it's more designed, as you'll see in a moment when I bring out the console, it's more designed to slot into the back of the console and look pretty than it is to actually hold in the hand for long periods of time. It's really, really not a comfortable use, which is a shame because the hardware inside is actually very good, and having a wireless retro controller is a very nice thing indeed. You can buy more of these. I mean, some people use these and are actually quite happy to use them, you know, and don't have any problems with comfort at all whatsoever. So if you are one of those people, you can buy extra ones. As you can see, it does the Wii thing there. It's actually got 4 lights down the bottom. There are 4 lights! And this, start right there for you. And this will allow you to connect up to 4 wireless controllers for multiplayer shenanigans. Which is useful because, as you will see in a moment, you can't really use any of the traditional multi-taps with it. So let's look at the console itself, shall we? Let's move these. Right. So, here is the Retron 5 itself. You'll forgive it being a little bit scuffed and a little bit sort of dusty and less than pristine brand new condition. This is because, as will become apparent during this review, I'm actually very fond of this console. It gets toted around a lot, it gets taken around different places, and it gets used a hell of a lot. So, hence the sort of scuffs and things. Okay, so let's look at the console itself. So, holding this up for you to see, we have cartridge slots for, hold this at the right angle for you, cartridge slots for the Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive as it was called over here in Japan, the Super Nintendo, the SNES, the NES, and the Famicom. Now, the Famicom being the Japanese version of the NES, of course, the original, you would think uses the same cartridges, but it doesn't. Actually, because the desire from Nintendo of America was to make the Retron, to make the NES look more like a domestic appliance than a games console. It was designed to kind of look like a front-loading VCR. So they redesigned the cartridges to make them look like big, chunky videotapes, basically. So the original Famicom cartridges are very different in size and shape. As you will see, I have some to show you. So it requires its own cartridge slot. And of course, oh sorry, let's not forget that. Of course, we have a slot in the front for, it's labelled GBA there, but it's actually will take Game Boy and Game Boy Color cartridges as well, because of course it will. So on each side of the cartridge, on each side of the console, you have 3 ports. One for Mega Drive controllers, one for NES controllers, and one for SNES controllers. Here it is on the other side there. Now, when you get the console new out of the box, they all have these rubber plugs in to keep the dust out, which is a really nice little inclusion. Mine, of course, are plug-free. The rest of these plugs are in a drawer somewhere because these get used a hell of a lot. And as you may have noticed from the fact that Mega Drive plug is in, I'm more likely to play multiplayer SNES and NES games than I am Mega Drive. And finally, let's look at the back of the console so you can see the ports there. So there is an SD card because, yes, it has SD card support, which we'll get to in a moment, and it's very important to note it does not come with one in the box. So if you are inclined to use the features that the SD card will enable, and in fact if you want to upgrade your firmware, you are going to need to supply your own SD card. It will allegedly take up to a 32GB. I've only been able to test up to 16GB with a sort of generic branded memory card, but it works fine. So next to that we've got the HDMI socket, because this is how it connects to your television. We've got the mini USB socket for charging the controller, and we have the power cable connector. There's nothing really interesting on the bottom, it's just grey with a little exhaust port for the fan. It's got little rubber feet. It's very nice indeed, and that's the wrong way round. So this is where we talk about the controller again. So just to demo that for you. That's what it's, that's what it looks like when the controller's slotted in the back there, which is, it's a nice feature. It's nice that it has that extra space. I don't know whether it's because the internal electronics require the extra space, so they decided to make use of the case a bit better, or it's the other way around. They've just sort of added that in. But it's nice. It's nice it's there. But again, the controller isn't the most comfortable to use. Okay, so let's talk about the games it supports. So as I mentioned, this is a Famicom cartridge, the original Super Mario Brothers, if you're interested. And yes, unlike the sort of boring grey and occasionally black NES cartridges, these came in a variety of colours. The original Mario Brothers is bright yellow, and I think it's gorgeous. So that goes in there. You can play NES cartridges, and these can be both European and American. There are no region locks on the Retron 5. So here's my Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt cartridge. Oops. There we go. You can play SNES cartridges. So I have here a Japanese cartridge, which looks almost identical to the European ones, of course. I have a European cartridge. And I have the big old chunky American cartridges, which, sorry American followers, but your cartridges are big, chunky and ugly. So sorry about that, but it's just how I feel, man. And sticking with Nintendo for a moment, original Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. The Retron will play all of these. And finally, for the Sega fans, there is Mega Drive. Now, I should stress, you can't actually keep... It looks like you can keep the cartridges in the console at all times. And actually, we've got this, something I didn't point out. We've got this lovely little light at the front. So there's a little blue LED there that will light up depending on which console is in use. But you can't actually have multiple cartridges plugged in at the same time. The Retron does not like that. So you can only leave in the one that you actually want to play. So I'll demo in a moment. We'll do a jump cut. And we'll demo in a moment what happens when you plug a cartridge in, because how the Retron runs is rather interesting. One word of warning, and this has been widely documented, the cartridge slots can be a little stiff. Not quite as bad as some people have made out, but I mean, better than stiff than toolies, otherwise they're not going to read your cartridges. But you do need to be careful the first few uses of pulling those out, because those will stick. So, there we go, pull those out. Alright, so far so good. It plays all of these, it upscales them in 720p 60 frames per second. That all looks rather lovely. So, what's the downside? Well, there isn't really, and yes, it can play ROMs. Now, this is not a documented feature, but it's something that the Retron 5 doesn't, that Hyperkin, don't try to keep under wraps either. So yes, you can play ROMs on it, but there is no native ROM support. Publicly, Hyperkin are very much, no, you need to own the original cartridge. And as such, you need to leave your cartridge in while playing, because the console is emulation-based. It's not a hardware clone like the Revo K101. It is a series of emulators ostensibly running on an Android-based operating system. Excuse me there, a little burp. So what happens is you plug the cartridge in, it will read the cartridge, and it'll actually display the name of the game, it will read the cartridge header, and it actually dumps the cartridge ROM to the internal memory, and then it will use the emulators on board to play the game from there. Now, this can be a bone of contention with collectors, because there are a lot of collectors that frown on emulation. They, like me actually, I've publicly on record a number of times to say I do prefer playing games on the original hardware. It's like listening to music on vinyl, you know, it's the medium that old music was designed to be played on, and it sounds better in the original medium, and thus playing games on the original hardware, they play the way they're supposed to play, and they're generally more enjoyable. However, the downside to emulation, this is where my stabby judgmental finger comes in, the downside to emulation is, of course, that the downside to the original hardware, I should say, is that it looks pretty piss poor on modern televisions. In fact, a lot of the time they don't upscale properly, there's lag because of upscaling, and they just don't play the same, they don't feel the same. Because the Retron runs on emulation, whilst it could be argued they probably don't feel exactly the same as they do, although, having run this around to several friends, several retro collectors, and had them play on it, the general consensus is actually they can't tell the difference between that and the original in terms of feel and the timing. It will look great, and it will respond brilliantly. There is no lag, especially if you're using game mode on your television, if it has one. So it's generally a pretty wild ride, and it lets you play those games looking great. So I would argue that the Retron 5 is probably best thought of as a living room box. So you've got your gaming room or your bedroom, wherever you keep your retro consoles and your CRT TV, because that's the thing. If you want your retro games to look great, you have to track down a CRT television, and if you want them to look the best they can look, you're looking for a bloody great Sony Trinitron, something which are getting increasingly difficult to find in the wild, and you've got to find the room to put them. Little flat screens they are not. So the Retron 5 is a lovely little thing to sort of have in the living room, so you can just whack the games in, no fuss, and have a little bit of a blast. Okay, getting back to the ROMs. So officially it does not support ROMs. Unofficially, it's actually rather easy to get it running ROMs. You can't just drop them onto your SD card and boot them up. It doesn't work that way. But what you can do, and what leads me to one of the Retron's other lovely little features, is you can sideload them by loading them as patches, because the Retron does have full and public support for game patches. Now, why might this be required? Well, let's say somebody's done a homebrew Super Mario and you'd like to play those levels. Well, you can. You just patch the ROM the same as you would on an emulation on your PC, but you play it with your original SNES controllers. What if you've bought a Japanese game that isn't in English? You go out and find the fan translation patch, and you can run that as well, which is something that I have done for Final Fantasy VI, and what is known in this country as Earthbound is actually called Mother 2 in Japan. So these are all very useful features, and we'll sort of cut away and demo. So let's do that cutaway. Let's demo, because what you're interested in now is how does it run. So let me show you some of the games that I've got running on the Retron. Okay, Geek Planeteers, let's demo the Retron 5 system for you. Now, if you've got this far in the review, what you're interested in is how the games look, how they sound, how they play. So when we get to game footage, I'm just going to present that. You won't get commentary over that. I'm just going to present some game footage, you know, for each console, so you can just have a look and see how your games are going to look upscaled on your television. But I wanted to show you the menu and sort of the various features available first. So this is what you'll get once you've booted up the Retron 5. There's a little splash screen and then this. So in the top right there, it will light up if you've got any of the Bluetooth controllers connected. I'm actually currently using an NES controller, and the SD card icon is lit because I have my SD card plugged in. So let's start by showing you the sort of options. Now these two are only viable if you've actually got a cartridge plugged in, so we'll do that in a moment. So let me just show you the settings. So this is all controlled via the NES controller, whatever controller you've got plugged in. Okay, so we have filter options, as you can see. I leave filter options off and I put the scanline filter on because I happen to think it looks better like that. As you see here, I can put the scan lines on for the main menu or off again. There's aspect ratio options here. Again, I leave that as normal. What it will do is center the image and you'll get black borders left and right. That's perfectly fine by me. And we can see various options here. I'll just scroll down so you can sort of get a gander about what's on offer. And here you can manage the Retron 5 Bluetooth controllers, and now button mapping is quite interesting. Okay, so you can actually, it's detected that I've got an NES plugged in, so you can actually tell it how to sort of map buttons based on, so if you've only got, say, a SNES controller, you can still play Mega Drive games with it, you can still play NES games with it, you can still play GBA games with it, and so on and so forth. But you may want to specify the button mapping. Hotkey configuration, this is interesting as well. So you can tell the, by selecting these options, you can specify a button combination. By default it's down and start to return to the menu, for example, but you could have it start and select together, you could have it the shoulder buttons together. So when playing, and you can specify this for each console individually, each emulator individually. So for example, on the SNES emulator I have it so that if you press L and R together it takes the screenshot. That will save to the memory card, and it's really useful if you want to get, like I do a lot of photoshopping, it's very, very useful if you want to get some console screen grabs for that. Yeah, console region, you can set it to auto, or you can actually, which will basically region free, or you can actually specify the region, so it will behave differently. And we've got, yeah, there we go, various options down here. Now, write firmware request, update request to SD. The console is not Wi-Fi enabled. It's not network enabled. So how do you get a firmware update onto there? Because they release them semi-regularly, Hyperkin do. Well, what you have to do, and this is one of the other reasons that you need an SD card, you put the SD card in, you hit this option, it will write a file to the SD card. You then plug that into your PC or Mac or what have you, visit the website, the Retron 5 website, and it will read that firmware update, and it will deliver the best update for your console automatically, which you can then download back onto the memory card. If you then plug it in, you can actually run that update from the menu. Okay, so let's plug in a cartridge and show you what happens. See what happens? I know what happens. Show you what happens. Okay, so I'm going to plug in an NES cartridge here, and you'll see what happens. So it recognises the cartridge being read. It actually reads, you see the title at the top, that isn't downloaded from a database or anything. Again, the console is not network enabled. It's actually reading that from the cartridge header, and 99.9% of the time, irrespective of the region of the cartridge, those are actually in English. So now that there's a cartridge inserted, we can go to the game menu, and this gives us a number of other options. So it does have cheat support. It requires you to put them into an XML file via the cheat database. Game-specific settings here. So this is where we can actually patch our game. And this is where we can also sideload our ROMs, because, again, the Retron 5 doesn't have any native support for ROMs. However, if you create a quote-unquote patch file that contains another game entirely and patch it to the cartridge you've got plugged in, then you can play that game quite happily, and you can turn the patch on or off. So, for example, like down here, I've got my ROM hacks directory. I don't have any for the NES at the moment. Oh no, that'll be in sideloads. There we go, silly Matt. So down here's my ROM sideloads. To go into NES requires Mario. So you need to have the cartridge that matches the patch, obviously, and then that patch file actually contains the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game. At which point, if I now run this, it will actually run Ninja Turtles instead of Mario. So we don't want to do that though for demo purposes, so we can remove that current patch. And again, I will cover sideloading of things if people are interested in a separate video and show you how that works. Okay, and this is where you can copy the save area of the cart back to the Retron, because by default it will just read the ROM and it will behave as if it's a brand new cartridge without any save files. When you start saving, it will just create a save file on the game's internal storage or the SD card if you set it to do it there instead, as I have. And you can do that the other way around, copy the save back to the cartridge. I've tested this with a variety of formats and they've all worked brilliantly. The only exception to this is, for whatever reason, my copy of Pokemon Fire Red, that doesn't work with. It is a genuine cartridge, I have obviously checked that. The Retron has a very hit and miss with fakes. So if you've got a dodgy cartridge from eBay that you bought for a too good to be true price, then odds are it's not going to work. I haven't managed to get it running any of the multi-carts I've got or anything like that. It does support some of them. I've got a bunch of fakes which I keep around for testing purposes. A couple of them, so Pokemon Emerald worked okay. Some of them didn't. So yeah, it's really hit and miss. So you're better off sticking with your genuine cartridges. Right. Okay. So that's the menu, really. So yeah, I'll now skip to some game footage, and you can see the Retron 5 and hear it, of course, in action.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
So, I think you will agree, actually, fairly spiffy. I'm doing the Ashens thing again here, aren't I? So yeah, I think you'll agree, actually very spiffy indeed. Now, yes, it's not exactly the same as the experience on the original console, but it's as near as damn it. And the save game backup feature that the Retron's emulation allows is very useful indeed, because, of course, games in the olden days that had save features required battery backup. Now, if you're like me, you've bought a soldering iron and you've taught yourself how to crack open those cartridges and replace that battery. But it's a really fiddly feature, and if you've already got save information on the cartridge, you're going to lose that as soon as you take the old battery away. Here's where the Retron 5 can help again, because in addition to allowing you to download that save file and drop it onto the internal memory or your SD card, it will also allow you to write it back to cartridge. So you can conceivably, as I have done with, say, my Pokemon cartridges, drop the cartridge in, back up the save file, change the battery, which wipes it, reload the save file onto the cartridge, and take it away and play it again on your original hardware. So, for the last time I checked, when I bought this, it was, I think, £120, £119.99. I'm not sure if that's still the price, but for £119, you're effectively getting a save game dumper, which you can then, of course, copy on to your PC and use on other emulators as well, if you so wish. Back it up on a memory stick. Do what you like. It's data on a memory card. But you're getting something that can dump your save game files and save your old childhood backups, your old childhood save games, in addition to actually playing them on your modern television. So, yes, that's the Retron 5. It's a double thumbs up from me. It's a great little console. As I say, for £120, it's really reasonably priced, and it lets you play a variety of games. Ah, yes! So I've probably mentioned this in the game footage, but I didn't mention this earlier. You can play Master System games on it as well, but you can't do it natively. There isn't the slot for it. So the way you do that is... Excuse the squeaking chair. It takes Mega Drive games, and therefore it will also take the old Mega Drive Master System converter. Now for this, and I suspect this is the other reason for this cartridge slot at the back, as you would with the original Mega Drive, you plug that converter in there, your Master System games go in there, or if you have games on card, they go in there. It will take the Mega Drive 2 version of the same converter, which doesn't actually have the card input. So these you can still find kicking around on eBay. if you can find one with a card input, I would suggest you do so. There weren't many games released on card, but it means you can play the ones that were. And I haven't had a chance to do this. I don't know whether if you put in a foreign, a non-European game into that slot or into the top there, whether the Retron 5 would still run it, because I didn't have any to test. I would assume that you can. Ignore that. I meant to do that. So, yes, it's a lovely little console, well worth the £120 asking price, and, whether you're into emulation, so it'll let you play it on the TV, or whether you're into the original cartridges, it's well worth it. I will say the downside to the side-loading feature is that you do require at least one game to side-load alongside. So if you don't actually have any original games, you're going to need at least one per platform if you plan to sideload ROMs. But you know what? Just go out there, find yourself a cheap cartridge. Find one of the old football titles or something like that you can get on eBay for £1 a pop, and just do that. If people are interested, what I might do is another video explaining how we sideload ROMs. But for now, that's the review. As I say, thumbs up from me, and well worth the money.